Hello students, I am Radhika HUman and I work as a legal researcher with an NGO on gender and human rights. Now we embark upon our module on human rights, development and democracy. Over the past few decades, there has been significant discussion on development and economic growth as the path to a nation's prosperity. But how exactly does development interact with human rights? Through the course of this lesson, we investigate development and human rights, the old debates and the new challenges. Traditionally, development and human rights were considered distinct, exclusive fields with little relationship between them. Development was viewed as a purely economic activity targeted at macroeconomic growth, which meant that development policies were targeted at increasing the GDP of a country, at improving the balance of payments account, etc. Whereas human rights was treated as a legal and political ideology and strategy completely unrelated to economics. From then, we have reached a stage now when there are two relationships that are imagined between development and human rights. First is development as a human right, which is the right to development, declared for the first time in the UNGA Declaration on the Right to Development in 1986. And second is the human rights based approach to development, which was enunciated in the Declaration and Program of Action at the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights in 1993. At this conference, the relationship between development and human rights was cast as one of interdependence and mutual reinforcement of democracy, human rights and development. Through the course of this lesson, we mapped the journey of human rights and development from a position of exclusion to this position of mutual reinforcement. Specifically, we address two questions. First, what precisely is the relationship between development and human rights doctrinally and philosophically? And secondly, we investigate the human rights based approach to development and its praxis. Authors differ on the exact nature of relationship between development and human rights. Some say that both are entirely inconsistent with each other. Some say that they are entirely consistent with each other. Some claim that they are in a relationship, they're in a complementary relationship, that they are not necessarily inconsistent, that they are duplicative, that they're opposed to each other. Jack Donnelly, for instance, a leading human rights scholar, states that there is no direct link between the two, whereas Philip Alston and Mary Robinson beg to differ and cast the relationship as one that is mutually reinforcing, whereas Ham states that development and human rights are interdependent. In order to really analyze what the relationship really is, we trace the history of development. Development was first imagined as macroeconomic growth alone. It assumed this constant focus on macroeconomic growth through increased GDP, assumed that microeconomic growth will follow suit, assumed that alleviation of poverty, hunger, disease and illiteracy would naturally flow out of a focus on macroeconomic growth. It assumed that social and political inequalities will radically transform as a result of this focus on macroeconomic growth. But none of this really happened. This paradigm failed to secure the basic needs like education, healthcare for citizens and vulnerable populations. It had a deleterious impact on the environment, and it in fact greater incentivized inequalities politically and socially. Owing to all the problems that arose out of the first phase of development as macroeconomic growth alone, in the 1970s, developmentalists reoriented themselves around the basic needs approach, where the focus was on securing the basic needs of citizens, such as medicine, healthcare, access to education, food, water, sanitation, etc. And this is because the focus on free market forces, as in the first phase, was found inadequate, since the free market only served even the basic needs only to those entities that could afford to pay for it. So even while the phase of the 1970s was focused on the basic needs approach, there was a counter revolution in the 80s and the 90s through the wave of structural adjustment programs in development. This marked a return to a focus on economic laissez-faire within countries. And the structural adjustment programs, or the SAPs, of the World Bank and the IMF mandated as a precondition to aid and loans to developing countries radical reorientation of their economy. To ensure efficient use of aids and loans, developing countries were now required to follow a policy of free market capitalism, to free up their trade policies and be very liberal to foreign investment. A minimum role of the state withdrawing to law and order situations or to facilitating the free flow of investment and trade, and the abolition of welfare measures meant for vulnerable populations. So while as a result of these structural adjustment programs, the GDP of countries did greatly rise, the pitfalls of this approach were even greater. Structural adjustment programs radically increased inequalities and deprivation in populations. And it was also noticed that the cost of development was borne by one entity, whereas the rewards of it were reaped by another entirely. This had the consequence of massively increasing inequalities within a country and leading to further deprivation. So for instance, in Zambia, as a result of the structural adjustment programs, there was a massive reduction in nutritional standards because the structural adjustment programs mandated a growth of cash crops over food crops. In Senegal, for instance, there was a reduced access to healthcare and education because market forces served even essential services only to those who could afford to pay for it. So while there was some boon to the method of development during this period, in the form of the emphasis on good governance and the condemnation of corruption, their objective was very limited. Good governance was encouraged and corruption discouraged only as far as it encouraged economic efficiency. These programs elided the structural and economic violence on the deprived in the name of good governance that was served by economic efficiency. It neglected the social, cultural and political impact of development on the people. So against this background generated the debate on development and human rights and viewing the two of them together. There were two approaches. First, that the violence enacted through the development process necessitated a human rights based approach to development. And second, the severe deprivation faced by groups that were already vulnerable necessitated the imagination of a right to development. So what is the doctrinal and philosophical relationship between development and human rights? The United Nations casts it as a relationship of interconnectedness and mutual reinforcement. Why? First, because the goals of human rights and development are very similar and therefore can gain from each other. So, the objectives of development are provided a concrete form through social and economic rights of food, health, housing, etc. Authors such as Omenique further posit that fundamental rights themselves are claims required for human development. Ham, on the other hand, states that human rights approach to development is justified due to the universal moral commitments that states have made to upholding human rights, which also direct their institutions and institutional policies. This moral commitment is exemplified through the voluminous international treaties, conventions, and other documents that translate human rights into a contemporary ethic and morality. This has assumed such importance that some parts of these treaties have even passed into the domain of customary international law. And human rights are not merely moral commitments, they are also legal obligations that are cast upon states. Most international human rights instruments imagine the furtherance of human rights as a collective project, where international cooperation is greatly mandated. So collectively then, human rights attain a transcendental nature, which must then become the goal of development policy in itself. This ties in with Amartya Sen's imagination of development as Amartya Sen's theory of development. This ties in with Amartya Sen's theory of development as freedom. According to Amartya Sen, development must secure the expansion of human capabilities to lead the kind of life that individuals may choose for themselves. Peter Ewin states that Sen's idea of freedom in this manner is instrumental, constitutive, and constructive for development, thereby establishing the interdependence and inseparability of development and human rights. Scoglie, on the other hand, presents political and economic reasons for a human rights-based approach to development. He states that sacrificing human rights at the altar of development may cause irreparable harm to societies. This irreparable harm may in turn hamper development for the future. Therefore, to ensure that development continues on the track that it intends, human rights must also be simultaneously respected. But since Scoglie gives only an instrumental value to human rights for the purpose of attaining development, he also states that human rights may sometimes be sacrificed for the sake of economic progress. There are other authors, such as Philip Alston, who state that there is no necessary relationship between development and human rights. He states that while they might overlap, this overlap is neither conceptually nor empirically inevitable. To add substance to his argument, he makes reference to the Millennium Development Goals. He states that the Millennium Development Goals make only a very passing reference to civil and political rights. And even where the Millennium Development Goals do address economic, social, and cultural rights, they address a very narrow field of the rights that are actually covered in the human rights instruments, such as the ICESCR. Jack Donnelly analyzes this relationship further. He states that if there is any convergence between human rights and development, it is more an outcome of empirics than of philosophy. He states that human rights, as minimum guarantees of dignity, act to constrain democracy from violating dignity which might otherwise be done on account of popular will. The only reason that democracy and human rights are viewed consistently and as reinforcing each other is because modern polities prioritize human rights over democracy. Therefore, fundamental rights vest in citizens which the state cannot erode even through democratic processes. Similarly, a relationship between human rights and development can only be established if development is defined in a manner that makes human rights tautological. and that there is actually no automatic relationship. He cites the example of severely repressive political regimes, such as in South Korea, China, Singapore, and Taiwan, who have attained a high degree of economic growth despite their political repression, which clearly indicates that there is no direct relationship between securing civil and political rights and securing growth. Furthermore, he states that liberal market frameworks within which most development work is actually undertaken operate to produce efficiency and profits, and not to satiate needs and welfare of population. In their operation, suffering is generated by design, which is sought to be obviated by the welfare state. So, despite redefinitions, development continues to be a primarily market-driven economic project, and it is in that sense that most countries still understand it. Development theorists argue that the language of rights really has no solution to real problems of redistribution and access. To which authors like Mary Robinson and Jean Drèze state that rights should not be understood narrowly as purely legal claims justiciable in the courts of law alone, but as entitlements of individuals and consequently the obligations of states and other actors to deliver upon. Shano further states that the promise of human rights in development lies in converting the areas in which they do converge as an area of human entitlements. The World Bank and the IMF have offered a different kind of resistance to viewing human rights, to viewing development through the lens of human rights. They state that human rights is a matter of sovereign policy alone, with which they are not concerned. But historically, human rights have developed in a manner that casts them not as the responsibility of sovereign states alone, but as moral and legal obligations of all institutions. The second prong of this approach is the evolution of the right to development in itself, which relates to Donnelly's argument that unless development is defined in a manner that includes human rights, there is no necessary relationship between the two, which is what happened in Vienna in 1993. To put this in perspective, this was around the time that there was increased convergence between different human rights instruments. While earlier only civil and political rights were imagined as human rights, increasingly economic, social and cultural rights were also gaining currency within the human rights paradigm. It was the end of the Cold War era, and with the adoption of the ICE-SCR, some legitimacy was shrouded upon the second generation rights as well. And it was in this context that the Vienna Declaration in 1993 stated, and I quote, "The right to development is an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in and contribute to and enjoy economic, social, cultural and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized." The Vienna Declaration therefore supplies a normative content to development activities. It extends beyond viewing development it extends to viewing. The Vienna Declaration supplies a normative content to development activities. It extends beyond viewing development as a matter of economic growth alone, and instead posits that development must be viewed holistically and in an integrated manner, which also addresses social, cultural and political participation. Therefore, development becomes an all-encompassing right, demanding an integrated enjoyment of all other rights and fundamental freedoms, which makes one wonder whether the right to development in 1993 added anything new to the existing enumeration of rights at all. We now proceed to the second part of this lesson, which is what does the practice and implementation of the human rights based approach to development mean? Peter HUman analyzes the value that the human rights based approach adds to development. He posits that through this approach, rights should not be viewed as fixed properties or legal certainties. Instead, the human rights based approach to development takes development out of the zone of needs and claims, needs and charity, and takes it into the zone of claims and entitlements. What is the impact that this has on development? First, it fosters accountability between donors and donees. Second, governments become obligated to deliver upon the claims and rights that citizens have. Third, this obligation of governments drives the policies and schemes of the government, which, absent a rights framework, may or may not be geared towards development. Fourth, this accountability may be penned not only in the courts of law, but through the political processes themselves. Because of this, Sen Gupta states that development becomes an integrated right, which warrants an allocation of resources also in an integrated manner. The obligation of poverty alleviation, for instance, therefore, gets cast not only upon individual states, but upon the international community as a whole. Methodologically, what is the framework, therefore, that the human rights based approach to development supplies? To quote Peter HUman, any process of change that is being promoted through development assistance ought to be participatory, accountable and transparent, with equity in decision making and sharing of the fruits or outcome of the processes. It is not dependent on the whim of a benevolent outsider, but rooted in institutions and procedures. A human rights based approach to development, therefore, dispenses with ad hoc mechanisms by which the end outcomes of healthcare and education might be supplied, but instead focuses on the evolution and development of institutions, state institutions or non-state institutions, and processes that seek to deliver upon the entitlements of citizens sustainably. They do so given the violent history that development has had in the past. HUman emphasizes that the human rights approach to development makes sure that people are able to participate in the fruits of the process as well, therefore obviating the inequality that has traditionally been an outcome of developmental activity. Human rights based approach to development therefore props three pillars of: one, participation; second, accountability; and third, transparency. How does this translate into the approach? Earlier, developmental activists also emphasized participation, but their view of participation in projects was limited to informing the concerned relevant populations that such a project will be undertaken. The human rights approach to development takes this one step further. Not only does participation warrant supplying information, but also actively taking the consent of those populations to the project in itself. Secondly, developmental theory emphasizes good governance for the sake of economic efficiency. Human rights approach instead requires a consolidation and strengthening of institutions and processes on a sustained basis, whose mandate then extends beyond just economic efficiency. to also ensuring social, cultural and political progress in a democratic and sustained manner. Third, traditionally, development focused on outcomes in improved indicators. So, projects whereby property rights were sought to be formalized were undertaken at a large scale, and the success of the projects would be evaluated in terms of how many of these plots of land and people were brought into the fold of the drive, and evaluated purely in terms of numbers. But as greater analysis of these drives took place, it was noticed that this formalization of property rights process had a side effect of eliminating the customary rights of women to property in itself. This reinforced patriarchal modes of holding property and passing it on only to the men in the community and in the family. What a human rights based approach to development would do would be to emphasize non-discrimination not only in the outcome but also in the processes, which means that those services would be disbursed in a non-discriminatory manner, that the fruits of those services would be enjoyed in a non-discriminatory manner, and the processes would be such that would ensure that existing discriminatory practices are not reinforced but overcome. To this paradigm, Shano says that development agencies must now recognize that they operate within a human rights paradigm. This requires institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to realign their methods and their strategies. What must be done as part of this process? First, they must change the activities that they undertake as developmental agencies. Second, they must change the methods and the motivations that they have for undertaking those activities. Third, they must evaluate their choice of partnerships with greater diligence to ensure that their partners are not participating in any, that their partners are not complicit in human rights violations. Third, yeah, that's what I was doing. Third, they must be more diligent in their choice of partnerships to make sure that their partners are not complicit in any human rights abuses. And fourth, they must also reevaluate the relationship that they have with states and other national and international NGOs in the delivery of services for development. But as human rights gained more currency over the past decade, it was noticed that institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund did begin to give greater lip service to human rights by mentioning it in their process documents, in their speeches, and in other paperwork, but without necessarily realigning any of their strategies, without necessarily ensuring that human rights would percolate down to the manner in which they undertake development as well. So, students, to summarize what we have addressed through the course of this presentation, we have sought to investigate the relationship that human rights and democracy have with development. We noticed how development was originally birthed as an activity of economic growth alone, which neglected social, political and economic transformation on the ground. Not only did it neglect these transformations, it in fact exacerbated existing inequalities and deprivations in developing countries. This necessitated a discussion on what the relationship should be between human rights, democracy and development. Different authors view this relationship differently. Some state that human rights and development are entirely consistent with each other. Others state that they complement each other. A third group would state that they are not necessarily inconsistent and that there is some scope for overlap. Some state that they are duplicative, while the last state that they are entirely opposed to each other. The stance that is endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly has been a stance that calls this relationship between human rights and development as interdependent and mutually reinforcing. So what does this relationship of interdependence and mutual reinforcement means? It means that developmental agencies, states, NGOs must now follow a human rights based approach to development. There is yet a second prong of this scenario as well, which is imagining the right to development as well. The right to development is imagined as an integrated, wholesome, comprehensive, all-encompassing right that permits the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms for all. Specifically, the Vienna Declaration calls the right to development as an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in and contribute to and enjoy economic, social and cultural and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. The right to development has been extensively critiqued for failing to add anything substantive to the existing paradigm of rights. While other authors endorse the right to development and its phrasing in such an integrated manner, by arguing that it lets states then allocate resources for development also in an integrated manner. And while this right to development is in operation, the human rights based approach to development emphasizes three pillars. First, of participation, second, of accountability, and third, of transparency, which means that agencies undertaking developmental activities must permit affected populations to participate in the developmental processes by taking their informed consent, that these agencies are accountable to the populations with which they are undertaking work and are not merely doing the work as a form of charity to serve needs, and third, that there is transparency in the manner in which this work is undertaken. The human rights based approach to development also ensures the evolution of sustainable processes and institutions which would be able to deliver development to populations on a sustained basis. Thank you.